Motocross. In this sport, the difference of a second can separate you from the rest of the pack. And some riders think that if they had aftermarket tricked-out suspension, they'd be the one in the winner's circle. So what does give the professional motocrosser that winning edge? We asked Micky Dymond, two-time national champion.
When you've been racing motocross as long as I have, you learn to appreciate the benefits of fine-tuned suspension. Suspension can mean the difference in winning and losing a race. There are no tricks or shortcuts. You've got to follow the basics.
Tuning the suspension on your YZ is not simply a matter of setting it and forgetting it. Instead, it's a process of testing, adjustment, retesting, and readjustment. So where do you begin? Ride height is your first adjustment. Ride height and other current suspension adjustments can be found in Yamaha dealer wrench reports for your model and rider's weight. Ride height, in our example, should be set to 96 millimeters. So just what is ride height anyway? To determine ride height, measure the distance from the rear subframe to the rear tip of the swing arm when the bike is completely unsprung. Then have the rider mount the motorcycle and center himself on the seat. Be sure the rider is suited up exactly as he would be when riding. Work the suspension a few times to avoid sticking and remeasure using the same points as before. Subtract the loaded measurement from the unsprung length to derive the ride height. If the ride height needs adjusting, loosen the lock ring on the spring and use a screwdriver to adjust the set length of the spring. Set length simply refers to the length of the spring as it is mounted in the shock. When you shorten set length, you shorten the ride height. When you lengthen set length, you lengthen the ride height. Adjust the set length of the spring as necessary, then remeasure using the same points as before until the ride height is correct. Then lock the spring's adjuster nut down at the correct setting. Now you're ready to set up the compression damping. Again, use the specifications in the wrench report for the initial setup. Compression damping for the model in our example should be set at 14 clicks out. Set the compression damping by turning the adjuster screw all the way in clockwise. Then back the adjuster out, counting the clicks. When you adjust the compression damping, you're adjusting the amount of resistance the shock exerts during compression. Back the adjuster out the number of clicks recommended in the wrench report, and you've preset the compression damping. Now set up the rebound damping. Rebound damping is adjusted at the base of the shock. Turn the adjuster screw clockwise until it stops. Then back it off to the number of clicks suggested in the wrench report. When you adjust rebound damping, you're adjusting the amount of resistance the shock exerts to reduce or dampen rebound. Preset rebound damping with exactly the number of clicks recommended. Now check the wrench report for preset specifications on the front forks. Although it is not necessary for initial setup, you should always change to fresh fork oil during fork rebuild. It's easiest to simply remove the forks from the bike. This will allow you to make several setup adjustments easily, and during rebuild you can check the general condition of seals, bearings, fork springs, and other components as you disassemble the forks. Remove all components carefully. Of course, you should always refer to your owner's service manual for complete fork disassembly procedures. Now, pick up the fork from the bottom clamp to avoid leakage and compress the forks over a drain pan to pump out as much of the old oil as possible. Be sure to hold onto the inner cartridge rod. Then mount the fork in a vise. To further disassemble the fork, remove the dust seal and the fork seal retainer clip. Extend the piston rod, then unbolt the bottoming cone assembly, which will split into two pieces. Remove the retaining clip, Slide the assembly off the shaft and insert the Yamaha cartridge holding tool. Now, loosen and remove the compression valve assembly. After removing the cartridge from the fork, grasp the fork tube firmly and use a slide hammer effect to remove it from the leg. Remove all components carefully. Now is the time to inspect all disassembled parts. Any sign of wear on bearing surfaces indicate the bearings should be replaced. A good bearing will have a full Teflon coating as shown here. To retain optimum performance from your forks, replacement is recommended after 10 hours of use. All rubber seals should be inspected closely. Check the O-ring seals on the compression valve for tears or abrasions. Pull on the valve to check spring tension. Look for debris and make sure the shim moves freely. Replace the assembly if necessary. And don't forget to check piston rod valving using the same techniques as for the compression valve. Now refer to the Yamaha owner's service manual for complete fork reassembly. First, on the inner tube, install the dust seal and fork seal retaining clip. Apply a generous amount of grease to the fork seal and install. Make sure all parts are facing in the right direction. Next, install the washer and fork bearing. The piston should then be installed onto the slot on the inner tube. Install the outer fork tube. Now, insert the piston rod into the cartridge and insert the cartridge assembly until fully seated. Then, replace the copper washer and compression valve. Be sure to grease both O-rings before installing. Torque the compression valve to 40 foot-pounds. Press the bearing into the fork slider using the Yamaha fork seal and bearing tool, making sure it is fully seated. Next, install the fork seal, again using the Yamaha fork seal and bearing tool. Replace the fork seal retaining clip until it is fully seated in its lower groove. Then install the dust seal. Now, reinstall the bottoming assembly and don't forget to replace the retainer clip and be sure all parts are facing the right direction. Check fork tubes for smooth movement. You're now ready to add fresh fork oil. Again, consult the wrench report or owner's manual for the recommended oil viscosity. For cartridge forks, Yamaha 01 oil is recommended. To get the proper oil measurement, be sure to install the spring guide and nut. Then add oil to the top of the fork. Work the outer tube not exceeding fork travel. And then bleed the cartridge assembly. Make sure all air is displaced from the cartridge. Fork oil level for your model can also be found in the wrench report. This diagram shows air and oil as they are contained in the fork. Fork oil level is actually measured from the top of the fork tube to the top of the oil in the fork when fully compressed. Set the marker on Yamaha's fork oil filler tool to the oil level specification. In our example, it's 145 millimeters with a fork compressed. Put the tool into the fork and use the syringe on the tool to withdraw any oil above the oil level you set. Now you can reinstall all the fork components. Extend the cartridge rod and replace the fork spring over the cartridge. Then, replace the washer and finally the fork cap. Torque the fork cap to between 13 and 16 foot-pounds. And keep your race prep manual handy. You'll want to record all of your preset adjustments so you can refer to them later on after your test ride. While the forks are off the bike, it's easy to preset fork compression damping as well. Compression damping for the YZ in our example is set at 6 clicks out. Turn the compression damper at the bottom of the fork all the way clockwise. Then, back the adjuster out the number of clicks recommended for initial setup on your model. Reinstall the forks on the motorcycle. Now, consult the wrench report for the fork tube height preset. Set each fork tube at the recommended height. With the fork loose, measure from the top of the triple clamp to the top of the fork tube, which is the seam below the fork cap. For optimum performance, it is crucial to torque crown and triple clamp to Yamaha specifications. Remount the wheel and tighten the axle. With the clamp still loose, compress the forks to relieve the clamp side of the fork from binding. And don't forget to lock down all bolts and check fork protector alignment. There's a lot riding on your suspension tuning skill. Don't forget to check air pressure in the tires. Tire pressure may not seem important, but it is a significant part of your YZ's suspension system. When you've finished and double-checked your initial suspension settings, your YZ is ready for break-in as described in your owner's manual. The initial suspension settings recommended in the wrench reports and manuals are good starting points, but comprehensive tuning actually takes several riding elements into consideration: the rider, his ability, his weight, and style. The suspension itself, its features, controls, and condition, and the course or track, its surface and layout. With experience, the rider who learns basic suspension tuning skills can apply them as his skills and style grow, and on various tracks and terrains. Once the suspension's broken in, you're ready to begin the process of track testing. And track testing is just that, a process of testing, adjustment, and recording tuning changes. Use the table in Yamaha's race preparation and tuning manual to log the setup specs you adjusted before break-in. Later, you'll use these setup specs to compare to the fine adjustments you make on the track. They'll keep you on target, and it's easy to get confused during active track testing, so have a friend watch the bike as you ride to help record suspension action and spot obvious problems. Once you're on the track and you've done a few laps for familiarity, try to ride the bike in the same lines. You've just set up the suspension to a base reference value, so regulate your riding style and try to eliminate the natural tendency of the rider to compensate for the suspension. Let the suspension do the work as you try to simulate actual speed and style during race conditions. Then, focus your attention on one part of the suspension and how it's working, say the front forks. Isolate and examine how just the forks feel. Do they bottom out even off medium jumps? Front-end bottoming or dive can be caused by several factors. If you eliminate each problem systematically, you'll quickly tune a front end that's a little too soft for your style and situation. If the front end bottoms, first try adjusting the oil level in the forks. Before adjusting fork oil level, though, let's review a little suspension theory. Inside each fork tube, a small pocket of air, which is compressible, is displaced by fork oil, which is not. Together with the fork springs, this air cushion is what absorbs shock to the front wheel. When the fork contains less oil, and therefore more air, the front end will be softer. When there is more oil and therefore less air, the fork will be stiffer. Bottoming results from forks that are too soft. So to stiffen fork action, you should add fork oil. Support the bike and tilt it forward to fully compress the forks and keep them vertical. Then add fork oil of the proper viscosity as before. Set the fork oil measuring tool 5 millimeters lower than your setup height. And withdraw oil until the new oil level is where you want it. Always make changes in small increments. And make a note of the change. Remember, 5 millimeters less measurement here means 5 millimeters more oil in the fork. Then, retest the suspension. You may need several adjustments to achieve a proper setting. And don't overdo it. A small change in the wrong direction can create forks that are too stiff and don't allow the full travel of fork compression. Stiff forks usually have too much oil, which displaces that air cushion and causes stiff fork action. To soften a stiff fork, remove 5 millimeters of oil with the oil level measuring tool as before. And make a note of the change. Don't trust your memory, write it down. Then retest the suspension and repeat the process until the front end feels right under the same conditions. If the forks are still too stiff or soft and you've run out of oil level adjustment, consider changing to a different fork spring. Yamaha provides fork springs in several different spring rates. Remember, only change springs after you've exhausted all your fork oil level adjustment. These forks are properly adjusted. The bike uses all the fork travel without bottoming on a medium jump, yet are soft enough to absorb smaller bumps as well. If your forks are okay over most of the course but seem a little stiff over smaller bumps, consider changing the fork compression damping from the preset adjustment. Remember, make all changes in small increments and make a note of the change. If your forks are okay over bumps and jumps, but suffer from head shake in the straights or oversteer, which is steering too quickly through turns, improper fork tube height could be the cause. Oversteer or knifing can result from a fork tube set too high. To adjust fork tube height, loosen the fork clamps as before and lower the fork tube just a millimeter or two at a time. Lock the fork at the new setting and retest. Again, don't overdo it. Here's the opposite problem, understeering, which causes the rider to go too wide into the turns. To correct understeer, raise the fork tube height in small increments, 1 or 2 millimeters at a time, and make a note of your change for future reference. Then retest the bike until you get the result you're after. Remember, after each race or test ride, you should release any built-up air pressure from the forks. Now you're ready to focus your attention on the rear suspension, and it's a good time to recheck the ride height. Working the shock spring during break-in and track testing may cause the spring to change its set length. Always recheck the ride height before each moto, comparing the unsprung measurement with the one you get when the rider's aboard. After you have rechecked and readjusted your ride height during break-in, check to see how much the rear end settles on its own weight. It should settle 20 to 30 millimeters from topped out. If the rear end settles more than 30 millimeters, then your preload is too low, and therefore your spring is too stiff. If your bike settles 15 millimeters or less, your preload is too high, and therefore your spring is too soft. Both cases will impair suspension performance, and switching to the correct spring rate is recommended. Remember that when you change a spring, you'll have to readjust the ride height due to the new set length of the spring. You should also reset the compression damping and other rear end adjustments to setup specs again. As you're testing the motorcycle, concentrate on how the rear end is performing. Does it tend to bottom out after average size jumps? Rear end bottoming might be the result of incorrect ride height, or it could be that the shock's compression damping is set too soft. When you adjust the compression damping, do so in small increments. 1 or 2 clicks here is plenty. And make a note of the change so you don't get confused later. Remember, when you're adjusting compression damping, you're adjusting the amount of resistance the shock exerts against the compression of the suspension. Here's the opposite symptom. The rear end is just too stiff, even over an average-sized jump. If the rear end is too stiff, turn the compression damper out a few clicks counterclockwise and make a note of the change. A properly adjusted rear end uses the full suspension travel without bottoming over average jumps, yet absorbs smaller bumps as well. Sometimes the rear end will be okay over single jumps, but may pack over the whoop-de-doos. Packing is when the suspension compresses over one bump without rebounding quickly enough to absorb the next bump in the series. As shown here, the wheel will pack up under the fender instead of rebounding to absorb the next bump. If the rear packs, you should decrease the rebound damping by turning the adjuster counterclockwise 1 or 2 clicks at a time. Remember, when you decrease rebound damping, you're decreasing the amount of resistance the shock exerts against rebound. If the rear end kicks you into front wheel landings or creates a pogoing effect as it kicks up in the whoops, the rebound damping is probably too quick, causing the suspension to kick as shown here. To reduce kicking, increase rebound damping by turning the adjuster clockwise 1 or 2 clicks at a time until the springiness is eliminated. Here's a properly set up rear end. The shock allows full compression of the suspension without bottoming, and yet rebounds in time, ready to absorb the next bump in the series. In rare cases, the nitrogen pressure in the rear shock might also affect shock performance and should be checked against specifications, but only by qualified Yamaha dealers. If you've tuned your suspension using the techniques shown here, the front end and rear end should be balanced. To be certain they are, though, you should perform one final check, the static balance test. Apply the front brake, put one foot on the foot peg, and push straight down several times. If the bike remains level as the suspension is compressed, the front and rear suspensions are balanced. If not, you'll have to readjust the suspension using the techniques you've learned. Once the front and rear suspension compress evenly, your YZ should be ready to take on the track and the competition. Now let's take a look at a properly tuned YZ suspension in action. Notice the rear wheel uses almost all the shock travel without bottoming, and that the wheel doesn't pack, even over the whoops. The front end also compresses fully on normal jumps without bottoming, yet remains soft enough to absorb smaller bumps as well. In general, the entire suspension seems balanced front and rear around the course. So if you're ready to compete professionally, or you're just serious about wringing the last ounce of performance out of your YZ, don't resort to black magic. Use a systematic approach to suspension tuning. Preset your suspension. Make changes in small increments. And record your adjustments in order to tune systematically. It may just pay off bigger than you think.